Oh, testing, testing.
Hey, good to see you. Yeah. All right. We ready?
Yeah, can we just get it?
All right, hold on. No, we're not. All right, the Rules Committee will come to order. Let me welcome everyone to the first Rules Committee of the 116th Congress, and I'm really happy to be here. So, I should tell you about. People have asked me about this gavel here. I noticed a few days ago I didn't have a gavel, and my dad came down to my swearing in, and I said I don't have a gavel, and he pulled this out of his pocket. My father owns a package store in Worcester, and for those of you who are not from New England, package stores are liquor stores. And he, for many years, was the head of the Worcester County Package Store Association. And so he's no longer, so he thought I should use this. So it says Walter McGovern, President, Worcester County Package Store Association. So anyway, a little bit of Worcester and the Rules Committee. I want to recognize our members on both sides. Returning members, Representatives Hastings, Torres, Cole, Burgess, and Woodall. Representatives Matsui and Perlmutter are also prior members joining us again temporarily, and we're happy to have them here. I welcome them back, and I especially want to welcome our new members, Representatives Raskin, Scanlon, Morelli, Shalala, and Lesko. It's great to have you on this committee, and I think you'd hear from the people who have been here that this is an incredible committee to be on, so welcome. Gaveling in this meeting holds a special place for me. Before I was elected to Congress, I first worked up here as a staffer. For much of that time, I worked on this committee for my friend and my mentor, Congressman Joe Moakley of South Boston. He was appointed to this committee and later as its chairman by another congressman, former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. Tip was on this committee as well. And I watched over the years not only what a well-functioning Rules Committee looked like, but what using power should look like. You know, Congressman Moakley, when he became chair, was asked by a reporter, "Oh, now that you're on the Rules Committee, you can settle all your old scores." And he said, well, that's not my style. He says, power to some is the ability to say no. Power to me is the ability to say yes. I've served on this committee for a long time, and I've heard yes from time to time, but I've heard no a lot. And I think one of the things that we're going to try to do, and I've talked to Ranking Member Cole about this, is to figure out how we can be more accommodating to both sides of the aisle. While closed rules are sometimes appropriate, I think 103 closed rules is excessive, and we need to do better, and I hope to work with my Republican friends to improve the process. As we meet for the first time today, I want to commit once again to my colleagues that we will run this committee professionally and under a more accommodating process. That doesn't mean we won't have structure, but it means changing the way we operate to give more members a voice. I'm proud that our first vote of this Congress was on a rules package that I helped develop with other members of this committee after consulting with our Speaker and our Democratic caucus and even with some Republicans. And it sets the course on it sets this Congress on a course to be more responsive to the American people and a more ethical institution that operates with integrity again. I especially want to thank the Republicans who voted for part of the rules package. As important as the rules package is, there is something that is even more important, and that's how we in this committee conduct ourselves week after week, month after month, year after year, because you can't legislate civility. This is a challenging time for our nation. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but it's also a time of tremendous opportunity. In entrusting control of this chamber to the Democratic majority, the American people voted for a Congress that is once again a place where big ideas are debated, where we tackle the issues that families actually care about most, from ethics reform to counter the influence of big money in politics to performing proper and responsible oversight of the executive branch. The Rules Committee will play an important role in that. I don't expect we're going to agree on everything, but I've already told our ranking member that I intend to follow the example of Chairman Moakley, and I will treat the minority with respect in the process. I want to again congratulate our new ranking member, Congressman Cole, on his appointment leading the Republicans on this committee. We have worked together for a long time, both here on this committee and more broadly in Congress on issues like the authorization for the use of military force. And I know he cares deeply about getting things done for the American people. He's a practical person who knows how to advocate for his position without alienating the people he is negotiating with. Congressman Cole, as I've said before, can disagree without being disagreeable, and he cares deeply about this institution. So even though we're of different political opportunities and persuasions, I think this could be a real opportunity to restore this committee to what it once was. So now, let me turn it to our ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any remarks that he might make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, again, frankly, I want to congratulate you, Mr. Chairman, on your appointment. I know that you and I have had the opportunity to interact a great deal this last week, both on the House floor and otherwise, and I want to echo what I've said on the floor here. While you and I have been on opposite sides of the dais in this room for a number of years, I've known you both as a passionate advocate for your beliefs, but much more importantly, as a good friend. I know you care deeply about the institution, and I think that caring will go a long way toward making the Rules Committee an open and fair institution with an open and fair process for all. I want to congratulate you both as a friend and a colleague and to offer you genuinely my very best wishes over the next 2 years. I would also note that in looking back at your career, I think it's an amazing achievement to have an individual go from being a staffer on the Rules Committee to being an elected member of Congress to becoming a member of the Rules Committee and then finally to becoming its chairman. If nothing else, it's a testament to how well former Chairman Joe Moakley chose his staff. Of course, if your staff this Congress is any indication, you're better at choosing staff members than even Chairman Moakley was in choosing you. Your staff has been a pleasure to work with in previous years, and certainly we've taken up the initial steps of organizing the committee for the Congress. I have no doubt that they'll continue to serve the committee and the House with honor and distinction. We're here today to take the next official step in the process of organizing the committee. As part of that process, we also must fill out our membership. I want to welcome back the returning members of the committee and extend a special welcome on both sides of the dais to the new members who will be joining us. So again, it'd be a pleasure to work with all of you. Though the hours here may be long and sometimes irregular, your service on this committee will be rewarding. The House cannot function without this committee. Every piece of legislation that comes to the floor under rule must go through here in some capacity first. As we work together over the coming 2 years, it's our duty to ensure that each bill complies with our rules and to ensure that the process is open, as fair, and as honest as we can possibly make it. I would note again, Mr. Chairman, as you said on the House floor during debate last week, that I know you care deeply about the institution and want nothing more than to foster an open and fair process. Over the years, you've repeatedly called for more open rules and more debate time. I do hope that the majority will hold to that desire in the coming Congress. Over the last week, you and I have had some in-depth conversations about how we would both like to see the Rules Committee operate over the coming 2 years. And I've been heartened by your stated intention to operate in as inclusive a manner as possible. I've also been heartened to hear from you that you want to respect minority rights and to solicit feedback and input from this side of the dais. I look forward to working with you on those things, as I know do the other members on the Republican side. Finally, Mr. Chairman, I know that each person here, each member on this panel cares deeply about our country. We all care deeply about our districts and our constituents, and we all care deeply about the House as an institution. In the end, we all want what's best for our country, for our constituents, and for all Americans. Mr. Chairman, I genuinely look forward to working with you and the other members of the Rules Committee and our staffs throughout the coming 2 years.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And Joe Moakley's looking down on you approvingly right now. So, I mean,
Maybe the last time.
right. Yeah, when he was ill, he appointed me to this committee. He had me appointed to this committee, and he said, you know, be patient. Don't do anything stupid like run for Senate. You know, good waiters get good tips. And if you're here long enough, someday you might be chairman. And so I'm sure he's very proud looking down on us right now. So the first item on our agenda is the adoption of the rules of the committee. Every member has received a copy of the proposed rules. These proposed rules have not been changed from the 115th Congress Committee rules. The majority will offer an amendment to the proposed rules. The text, which you received yesterday, and also have a copy of it at your desk. Likewise, the minority will offer an amendment, and you will have, and we've all been provided with a copy of that as well. We will discuss amendments shortly. So at this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, and the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, if you will grant me just a little latitude with reference to the persons looking down, our departed leaders, I'd be terribly remiss if I didn't say that Claude Pepper, one of the former chairs of the Rules Committee, was one of my mentors when I came here. Also, I don't think it unworthy of us to recognize that this would be a proud day for Louise Slaughter.
Absolutely.
And the extraordinary efforts that she put forward. And as a Democrat, I had the very good fortune to travel perhaps as much with anyone that traveled with him, with former Rules Chair Gerald Solomon. We traversed the world both ways with our attending persons. One final thing before the official duties I'm accorded, Mr. Chairman, is to thank both staffs, as you and our ranking member Cole have done. These young people do an extraordinary job for all of us, and the package that I'm about to move now under the leadership of Don Sisson and the staff, as well as the Republican input, it's a proud moment for me to thank you, Mr. Chairman, move that the committee adopt the committee rules from the 115th Congress for the 116th Congress. A copy of that proposed rule is at the desk for the purpose of amendment.
Without objection, the proposed rules will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The proposal calls for the adoption of the rules of the 115th Congress as the rules of the 116th Congress. As I mentioned, we want to amend the rules to add an additional subcommittee. This subcommittee will be tasked with studying expedited procedures in law and in the rules of the House. We need a venue to explore whether or not existing expedited procedures are working and how we can improve upon them. This is within the purview of the Rules Committee, and it is vital to the functioning of the House and to our national security. There were many instances in the past Congresses where these procedures failed to produce the intended results. For example, last Congress, Democrats introduced a war powers resolution that would have helped bring an end to the war in Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis in recent history. It was deprivileged. The Senate passed a similar resolution, but because our expedited procedures don't align with theirs, it was not privileged in the House. House Republican leadership refused to bring it to the floor. So these are matters of life and death, and I hope that we will take this opportunity to take a hard look at our existing rules and statutes to find ways to make them work better for the American people and our values. And at this point, I'd like to yield, before I turn to other minutes, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, for the purposes of offering an amendment to the rules.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I move that the proposed rules for the committee for the 116th Congress be amended in the form that I have at the desk, designated Amendment Number 1. The amendment would create a third subcommittee, the Subcommittee on Expedited Procedures. As you just observed, Mr. Chairman, there are numerous expedited procedures in House rules and in law, and having a specific place to study, revise, and reform them and to develop best practices with respect to expedited procedures will ensure that the House operates in the most efficient and effective manner possible.
So we've heard the amendment from Mr. Raskin. Is there any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the gentleman's amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Let's see. So the amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to committee rules. My amendment requires that the survey of activities produced pursuant to House rules include a compilation of all known points of order previously disclosed by the committee. While the survey of activities is required under House rules, such a compilation is not. And while this has been the practice and the Republican majority prioritize this, I think it's important to codify this practice to ensure that it continues regardless of who's in charge. It's important that members and the public can easily find this information in a useful form. In fact, I believe the now majority use this information quite often in holding the last Congress accountable on a number of occasions. So for those reasons, I would urge support of the amendment and urge its adoption.
So you heard the amendment from Mr. Cole. I support this amendment, and I think it's a good idea to codify this current practice into our rules. And is there any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the gentleman's amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Are there any other amendments or discussion at this time? So hearing none, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentleman from Florida as amended. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and the rules of the committee as amended are adopted. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Now, moving on to the next item on the agenda, Clause 2D of Rule 11, adopted by the House, provides that the committee chairman designate the vice chair to act on his behalf during his temporary absence. Pursuant to the rule, I designate the gentleman from Florida, the Honorable Elsie Hastings, as vice chair of the committee. I'd like to congratulate my friend Elsie. A few people in the House of Representatives have more institutional knowledge than my friend from Florida. He has served in the House for 26 years, including 17 years on this committee. We are fortunate to have his experience and knowledge and on this committee, and I'm proud to have him serve as our vice chair. So the next item on the agenda is the subcommittee size and ratios. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I move that the committee adopt the committee rules from the 115th Congress for the 116th Congress. A copy of the, just a sec. Mr. Chairman, pursuant to the Rule 5C in the rules just adopted, I move that each of the three subcommittees during the 116th Congress shall be composed of 5 majority members and 2 minority members.
You've heard the motion. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, the question is on the motion offered by the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The next item on the agenda is subcommittee appointments. Based on recent practice, we will postpone any appointments to those subcommittees until the chair and the ranking member have had such time to consult with members and each other regarding appointments to the subcommittee. Now is the time in this meeting that we will handle a few standard housekeeping items that we do every organizational meeting. Without objection, the staff on both the majority and minority of the Committee on Rules is approved. And I want to echo what everybody said here. We have an incredible staff in both the majority and minority, and they work harder than I think any other staff in any other committee, and I really am proud to serve with them. Without objection, the committee staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the rules adopted by the committee and rules reported by the committee for the duration of the 116th Congress, as we have done in the past several Congresses. Finally, I have a general announcement that I want to make about designating a floor manager for rules that will apply for the rest of this Congress. As has been standard practice for this committee, when we announce which member will manage a rule at the direction of the committee for the majority and minority, it is with the understanding that if a member is not available when the House is ready to consider the rule, another member will be designated to manage the rule. Before adjourning the meeting, I would like to recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli, who would like to say a few words about our former colleague, Louis Slaughter, who we all miss. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me also join in the congratulations to you on the chairmanship, and thank you for your support. For those of us who are new to the committee, I consider it generally bad form to speak at a first meeting that you're invited to, but I would be remiss if I didn't just take a moment to acknowledge the extraordinary career of Louise Slaughter. She was a friend of mine for nearly 40 years and encouraged many people to get into government and politics back in Rochester, New York, where we hail from. But she could not have been prouder than she was of her role here on this committee. And I know that she served with distinction, was named its chair in 2007, served as chair for 4 years, and then continued until we lost her as the ranking member. So I know our community has a long history with this committee, has great respect for it, but I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge her incredible service to this country, to my community, and I think it will always give me a great deal of comfort to know she's looking down upon us.
She'll
Thank you
be
for the
watching you, right?
She's watching over me, that's correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We all miss Louise, and we all appreciate her incredible service to our country. So that concludes the organization of the Committee on Rules, and without objection, the committee will adjourn our organizational meeting. We will now send the official meeting notice for the appropriations bills, and we'll begin our meeting on that package. So before we continue with consideration of the appropriations bills in front of us, I would like to have a discussion about reducing our committee's paper waste. For today's meeting, we have provided each of you with your own copies of the bills and amendments being considered. Moving forward, I would like to reduce that number by half, with 2 members sharing a hard copy of the bill and amendment text. This is not meant as a way to hide information from anyone, but rather an effort to be mindful about the amount of paper that we use and to save some more trees. However, I want this to be a collaborative decision, so I would like to hear from anyone that has a strong objections to that. Nobody. Good. That's great.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Hastings.
I don't have an objection, but looking forward, this is 2019, and as many of you know, I at one point was the president of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and I'm fond of saying if you can say that, you ought to be the president of that organization. But while I was president, I traveled to 56 of the 57 countries, and in more than half of them, they were already using computerized access for all of their membership in their respective parliaments. In addition, I visited several of the organizations that did have rules committees, and all of them had computers. While I'm not the most computer literate person here, I do believe looking forward, we ought to be considering that. I'm in full support of your amendment with reference to paper waste, but let's go all the way.
Yeah, and I think as we move forward, we can consult with the minority about what everybody feels comfortable with, and I think, but if we can reduce the paperwork somewhat, that's all good.
Yes, sir.
All right, so the Rules Committee is going to come to order again, and let me just begin by saying I was hoping to start the first meeting of the Rules Committee talking about the future, but instead we're dealing with the past. And we're, quite frankly, kind of cleaning up a mess that was created by the previous majority. And they enabled the president's shutdown by refusing to take up the Senate-passed bills to reopen this government. Instead, they passed a bill with money for a border wall that had no chance of passing the Senate. So I was on the floor multiple times pleading with the majority in the waning days of the last Congress to let us consider the bipartisan spending bills, and they refused. But it's a new Congress and a new majority, and one that will act responsibly to end this Trump shutdown. This president's temper tantrum over this stupid wall should never have led to any part of this government being closed for business, and certainly not agencies like the Agriculture Department or the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which are totally unrelated to border security. Food access for nearly 40 million Americans shouldn't be at risk. FHA's ability to help families achieve the dream of home ownership shouldn't be at risk. The safety of Americans visiting our national parks shouldn't be at risk. And I can go on and on and on. So we are here to do the responsible thing, to take up a series of 4 appropriation bills that recently passed the Senate: the Agriculture, Transportation, Housing and Urban Development, Financial Services, General Government, and Interior Environment Appropriations Bills. This president may be totally comfortable keeping this government closed for years, as he suggested recently at a press conference, but Democrats are not. The Trump shutdown shouldn't last another minute, and it wouldn't need to if the House and Senate passed these bills. Again, these are bills that recently passed the Senate by a veto-proof 92-6 vote. They passed the House as a package last week. We're now giving members the chance to vote again on these measures, this time individually. And let me remind my colleagues that Congress is a co-equal branch of government. If the president doesn't want to sign these bills, both chambers could pass them with veto-proof margins and reopen the government without the president's signature. So we are now 17 days into this Trump shutdown. Enough is enough. And so, having said that, I would now like to turn to my friend, the ranking member, Mr. Cole, for any statements he'd like to make.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First, I want to express my thanks to you and to our witnesses today for coming before us on a matter of such great importance. As you know, I've often said on the House floor that funding the government and keeping it open is one of the most important duties members of the House face. As such, I'm glad to see my colleagues in the majority making an effort to pass funding bills and to reopen the entire government. But that being said, I do think these bills are misguided and do not represent a serious effort to resolve the crisis we're currently facing. Let's take a look at what the majority is actually proposing. They're putting forward 4 appropriations bills for consideration this week, covering the transportation and housing and urban development, financial services and general government, agriculture and FDA, and interior and environment titles. All 4 of these were included in the package the House passed last week on a closed rule. Furthermore, all 4 of these bills represents the Senate work product on the FY19 appropriations. They do not take into account any of the work of the House Appropriations Committee did in putting together the FY19 bills. They do not reflect any of the work product of the conference committees appointed to iron out the differences between the House and Senate versions. In short, they do not represent any input at all from the House of Representatives. And they are again coming to the floor on a closed rule, which means that once again, the House will have no input at all into the appropriation process. I also note that the Senate has made it clear they will not pass these bills as written. The President made it clear he will not sign them into law. Given that we've already passed these bills, but the Senate won't pass them and the President won't sign them, why then are we here? What do we hope to accomplish? I would ask this of my friends in the majority. Have you had any positive conversations with the Senate on these bills? Are they now willing to consider these, either as part of a package or as standalone bills? Has Leader McConnell agreed to take this bill up on its own term? Has the President agreed to sign this bill into law if it passes? I think the answers to each of those questions is no. And if that's the case, then unfortunately this is clearly a political exercise in futility. Mr. Chairman, as you know, I've been a member of the Appropriations Committee for 10 years, and I understand that it's hard to have a full process on appropriations bills, but it is indeed possible, even when funding bills carry over into a new year or even a new majority. In early 2011, right after Republicans took majority control of the House, we considered a bill on the floor to fund the entire federal government, and we did it under an open rule. When we considered that bill on the floor, 162 amendments were offered from both sides of the aisle, and we had a grand total of 66 hours of floor debate on the bill stretching over almost 5 days. Given the amount of time we used in 2011, I fully understand what an enormous undertaking it would be. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't take time now. Unless you can tell me that the President's going to sign this bill into law, then there's plenty of time for thoughtful debate and time to hear ideas from all members of the House. I'd also point out that this package of bills doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is that of border security. Time and again, the American people have told us that they want more border security. None of these bills will address that problem. I do think that rather than putting forward bills that have already passed, the majority would do better to negotiate with Republicans and come up with solutions that serve all Americans. Mr. Chairman, in closing, I would just add that while I appreciate the good intentions in bringing forward these bills to fund government, I don't think the package before us today is sufficient. With only a closed rule and no House input on this package, members are being given only a take it or leave it option. And until we can work toward a real bipartisan solutions to open the government and fund border security, I would prefer to leave it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
No, and I thank the gentleman. I appreciate his comments about, a more open process, and I hope that that's the process we will follow when we get to our appropriations bills. And, but I guess the problem with, unlimited debate at this particular point is that the government shut down, and people want it ended now. And these bills passed the Senate, by 92 senators voted in favor of it. That's veto-proof. And we're hearing each and every day more and more Republican senators saying that we ought to pass these bills. We ought not to hold them hostage over this debate on this wall. And so, this is an emergency. And this is last year's mess that we're trying to clean up. And so we're going to keep on, doing this until we reopen the government. That's that simple. So at this point, we're going to try to call as many people up at once as possible, if that's okay. So just going to squeeze in. Mr. Quigley, Mr. Bishop, Ms. McCullum, Mr. Price, Mr. Calvert, Mr. Graves. If you all come up and.
Mr. Chairman, while they're readying themselves, if I may, with your
Absolutely, Mr.
permission.
Hastings.
Yeah, responding to my very good friend from Oklahoma, I don't think it's take it or leave it. I think it's open it or close it. And the fact that we asked the question whether or not the president is going to sign these measures if they were to come to his desk. First, if he chooses not to sign it, there's a layover period where it would become law anyway. It seems to me that's what's happening is all of us recognize that politics is at play here, but the Senate having approved these particular measures troubles me immensely that they would now take a different position. We are talking about opening the requisite committees of jurisdiction of this Congress and leaving the Homeland Security issue on the table until February 8th, a measure clearly passed by the Senate. So the other body, under its leadership, is escaping for the moment. But I would tell them that they can reasonably expect at some point during this shutdown that they are going to begin to experience heat. And once they do, I suspect that if we continue to offer measures that they have in fact passed, that we will be doing the people's business. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So I think we'll try to do this in a way that makes some sense. So we'll try to make sure that we match you up to your subcommittee. So we're going to deal with financial services and general government appropriations first. So Mr. Quigley and then Mr. Graves. We'll start with you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the ranking member, Mr. Cole. I appreciate serving with you on the Appropriations Committee, and I appreciate the opportunity to testify in support of the rule for the fiscal 2019 Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Bill. Mr. Chairman, congratulations. Your comments I have to mention. You talked about someone saying that you became chairman. Someone asked if it was an opportunity to settle scores. It reminded me of practicing in Cook County when an extraordinarily bad judge was appointed to the appellate court. Someone cynically said, you now have the opportunity to reverse all your bad decisions. The fiscal year 2019 FSGG Appropriations Bill that you consider today was developed by Chairman Langford and approved on the floor of the Senate by an overwhelming partisan vote of 92-6, bipartisan vote. This bill provides $23.688 billion in total discretionary resources, an increase of $265 million over the fiscal year 2018 level. This bill is fiscally responsible and makes hard choices among competing priorities. The bill rejects the president's proposed elimination of the Community Development Financial Institution Fund and cuts to the Small Business Administration, which provide necessary resources to spur economic growth, particularly in underserved communities. But most importantly, Mr. Chairman, this bill will reopen the Department of the Treasury, including the IRS, the Security and Exchange Commission, Small Business Administration, and multiple other agencies that have a direct impact on the lives and livelihoods of American families, businesses, and communities. By passing this bill, we were able to get more than 100,000 federal employees back to work and receiving a paycheck. As far as the substantive terms, the bill includes $12.7 billion for the Department of Treasury, including $11.6 billion for the IRS, to support its base operations implementation of FY17 tax legislation. It also includes an increase of $17.2 million above the FY 2018 enacted level for efforts to combat money laundering and terrorism financing. The bill maintains FY 2018 enacted levels for the Office of National Drug Control Policy, $368 million above the President's budget, to continue support for programs to target drug trafficking and address substance abuse problems at the community level. The bill also includes funding at the President's request for regulatory agencies to protect both businesses and individuals from unfair and unsafe business practices, including the Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, and the Securities and Exchange Commission. It includes full funding for the General Services Administration to perform major and basic repairs and alterations for federal buildings, which is necessary to address the backlog of maintenance projects across the federal government. The bill also provides a pay increase for civilian federal employees in 2019, while putting a stop to the excessive raises to the Vice President and other high-ranking administrative officials. In addition, the bill includes back pay for federal employees furloughed during the shutdown. A key feature of this bill is the total lack of controversial policy riders. This is a clean appropriations measure squarely under the jurisdiction of the committee. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, as you know, we have now entered the 18th day of the President's shutdown, the consequences of which compound daily. Fundamentally, it's time that we reopen government, and this bill does exactly that for a number of key agencies the American people rely on to be open, fully functioning, and ready to serve them. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the Rules Committee. I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Graves. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Cole, good to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to address the committee on behalf of all the members of the House of Representatives, and it's on their behalf that I'm asking for a more open process than we're being led to believe might happen. I know, Mr. Chairman, you said that we must move in haste. Well, in fact, we've been in this process for 17 days. I think we've had plenty of time in which to have a very open and thorough process. And if I remember last week, it was a majority that voted.
We've only been in control for 5 days. So
Well, during those 5 days,
you were in charge when I was trying to get recognized, and you wouldn't recognize me on the floor. So,
well, within
anyway.
those 5 days, I'll point out that last Thursday that the majority voted to go home rather than continue this process. So I'm glad we're back at it today. And so I want to address the Financial Services Bill that I worked with Mr. Quigley on last year. And I know he's introduced a bill that is identical to the Senate bill as it passed the Senate, or nearly identical. And unfortunately, it just does not reflect the House priorities, nor does it reflect the bipartisan work that he and I and others worked on. Each of our constituents, they elected us to represent our districts and our constituencies here in Congress and not to abdicate our responsibilities to the Senate. I think we all have our tussles with the Senate, and it's our opportunity to reflect House priorities. So by not allowing members to offer amendments tomorrow, we're really not allowing the bipartisan spirit in which I know this new majority has spoken of. So, for example, the Financial Service Bill that passed the House last year in July, we passed it out of the House, contained nearly $276 million for the Calexico, California Land Port of Entry, something that's very important, that fully funded that project, but yet the Senate bill is $100 million short. Just the same, this bill that passed the House last year included nearly 20, if not more, bipartisan pieces of legislation that dealt with financial reform, which were approved by this chamber, our body, the last Congress, with a vote of nearly 270 votes or more each and every time. That's bipartisanship, yet being omitted by the Senate. Democrats and Republicans, including Chairwoman Waters, sponsored many of these provisions that were included in the Financial Services Bill last year that passed the House. Building upon the Jobs Act from 2012, these provisions facilitated capital formation, enhancing our capital markets, providing targeted relief to financial institutions, but more importantly, protecting our constituents. Yet the Senate bill ignores all of this great bipartisan work that we did in the House last year. But it also shorts the Small Business Administration's entrepreneurial development programs by more than $10 million compared to the House-passed bill. Further, I know that from working with my friend from Illinois, the Senate bill is deficient in funding some of his priorities as well. And I know he's advocating for this position today, but I should point out that some of his priorities are being eliminated by the Senate. And if we were just to pass this and the Senate to pass it and be signed into law, then his constituency as well is being forgotten. For instance, the Consumer Product Safety Commission is $1 million below the House bill. It does not fund the grants for pool safety, which has been a major priority for Chairman Bishop, who sits right here next to me, and has been a longtime priority of many members of this body. Finally, the National Defense Authorization Act created a new structure for the Treasury Department's Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States. They need another $6 million to meet the requirements of that new authorization, which helps protect our nation's interest, yet it's not in this bill. So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cole, I'm ready to sit down. I'm ready to work together, as we did last year. And might I point out to this committee, and I know Chairman here from Illinois agrees with me, that we actually had a bipartisan agreement prior to the end of the fiscal year last year. Mm-hmm. It was negotiated. It can be done. But by simply ignoring the will and the voice of the House, both Republicans and Democrats, I don't think we're doing our constituents any service at all. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions.
No, and I appreciate your comments, and believe me, there are a lot of things in these appropriations bills that are not there that I would like to see there. But this represented a compromise. And by the way, I mean, this is last year's work. You guys left town and left this mess for this year. And we don't have days and weeks. People are panicked. I don't know about your constituents, but we're getting calls constantly, people wondering whether they get paid, whether they're going to be able to pay their rents or their mortgages. I mean, this is a crisis. This is an emergency. And so we want to have a more open process on the bills that we're going to be responsible for. We have a disaster supplemental coming up, and we put out a call for amendments. I don't know when the last time there was a call for amendments on a supplemental appropriations bill was, but there will this time. And so you can look forward to a more open process. But we got to reopen the government. We got to do it now. Let me now yield to Ms. McCollum and Mr. Calvert with the Department of Interior bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair McGovern, Ranking Member Cole, let me begin by congratulating you both on your new positions. And it is unfortunate that I'm testifying before you under these circumstances today, but nevertheless, I look forward to working with you in Congress. You and the other members of the Rules Committee have important jobs to do, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the FY 2019 Interior, Environment, and Related Agencies Appropriations Bill. The Interior Bill before us was drafted by the Senate and passed overwhelmingly with a bipartisan vote of 92-6. This bill should be very familiar to everyone, as it was part of a 6-bill package that passed overwhelmingly in the House with a bipartisan vote last week. This bill provides $359 billion, which is $601 million more than fiscal year 2018 enacted bill. It maintains funding for nearly every agency at or above fiscal year 2018 level, including the Environmental Protection Agency. It's important to note what this bill does not contain. There are no new partisan riders. And let me repeat, there are no new partisan riders in this bill. But it is clear I would have written some things differently, especially in regards to the funding for Indian country. However, this bill will immediately open up the Department of Interior, immediately open up the EPA and other agencies in this bill, and it will give us a path forward to end the Trump shutdown. This bill has one very important addition from the Senate Interior bill language that I would point out. This bill would ensure that federal employees at the Department of Interior, EPA, and other related agencies would receive back pay for the time that they were furloughed. Democrats are doing everything we can to quickly pass these bipartisan bills to reopen the government, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of this bill to consider moving this bill forward on the floor when we have an opportunity to vote on it. I would just like to point out one thing. Right now, there are tribes. We've been monitoring this, and I know this is something that our committee works on. I don't even say bipartisanly. We work on it nonpartisanly. And when we first did the Budget Control Act, healthcare was protected for the majority of Americans. Medicaid, Medicare was protected. We protected healthcare. But healthcare for our tribal brothers and sisters was not included specifically enough to protect them for that. And so they find themselves in the same circumstance again. And that is why, even though this is not as generous to Indian country and the great work that I did in a nonpartisan fashion with my colleague from the other side of the aisle, who's my friend, Chairman Calvert, as well as what we had worked out in the Senate, it is because, in my opinion, this is a life and death emergency. It's a crisis that we get tribal health care funding stabilized, that I wholeheartedly support moving forward with the Senate bill to the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Calvert, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, I'm here today to respectfully recommend an open rule for consideration the Senate proposal for funding the Department of Interior, Environment Protection Agency, and related agencies for the remainder of fiscal year 2019. As it stands now, this bill is entirely a Senate product. That's why an open rule for consideration of this bill on the floor is essential. Republicans and Democrats alike must be able to amend this bill on the House floor so it can reflect the priorities of the body closest to the people, the U.S. House of Representatives. Last year, my friend Betty McCollum and I worked extremely hard to write a bill reflecting House priorities. We held 9 budget oversight hearings, including 4 hearings dedicated to programs that honor treaty rights promised to our Native American brothers and sisters. And we wrote a bill that accommodated some shape or form roughly 93% of House member requests, regardless of party. On top of that, when the bill got to the floor, it was amended 50 times. And when told to begin negotiating the House passed bill last year, we defended it against competing priorities in the United States Senate. I'm extremely proud of our work. We're close to a final product. Let's not throw it away by rubber stamping the Senate before us, and I would hope we're not getting that habit. Let us highlight just a few of the House priorities missing in the Senate bill, which concern us the most and are likely concern to our colleagues on both sides of the aisle. The Senate bill provides $12 million less than last year's budget for the U.S. Geological Survey Natural Hazards Research and Early Warning Systems. That's the earthquake warning system on the West Coast. $24 million less for the Forest Service and Department of Interior wildfire hazardous fuel reduction programs. We just went through tremendous fires on the West Coast. These investments save lives, and with so many fires, earthquakes, volcanoes, and other natural disasters in recent years, we need to prioritize our limited funds. Additionally, this Senate bill provides $77 million less than the House Republican bill for EPA's WIFIA, Brownfield, Superfund remedial programs. These programs provide regulatory relief, leverage federal dollars, improve water infrastructure, and they spur economic development. Instead, the Senate bill increased funding for the EPA regulatory programs in many parts of the country, particularly agricultural states. EPA regulations, additional red tape, in my mind, are a bipartisan concern. And our beloved national park system, the Senate bill falls short, $27 million for park operations, reducing maintenance log. With park visitation on the rise, and even with a shutdown, this is no time to cut corners on its budget. This bill also lacks important reforms for implementation of the Endangered Species Act. It lacks the funding needed to prevent the sage grouse from being listed. Failure to prevent a listing will devastate local economies in 11 western states and would undermine our nation's energy development in that part of the country. The bill falls $160 million short of last year's House-passed bill in funding treaty obligations to American Indians and Alaska Natives throughout the Department of Interior and Indian Health Service. I might point out there's a front-page story today in USA Today about hospital horrors throughout Indian country that we should all be concerned about. And I know our new chairman is very concerned about that. We all work together to fix that problem. But this is not a good way to start. The Senate bill is $135 million less in the Indian Health Service than the bill that we passed last year. Let's not turn our backs on them in a haste to reopen the government. And finally, this bill is almost $10 million below last year's House-passed bill in funding the historic preservation grants something I know is important to our new chairman, including civil rights grants, grants to underserved communities. The House felt so strongly about these programs that it added $5 million in amendments on the House floor last year. Why will we give this funding up to recede to the United States Senate? Mr. Chairman, I hope we made a strong case today to open this bill up to amendments on the House floor. This week, let the House work its constitutional responsibility to control the power of the purse. Our members on both sides of the aisle deserve to have their voices heard. That concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to hear from Mr. Bishop and Mr. Aderholt on agriculture. So we're just going to, Mr. Quigley, if you just, yeah, good.
Both of us kind of have to get up at the same time, and let one person in. Excuse us, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and congratulations to you and to Ranking Member Cole. I look forward to working with both of you in your new capacities as you discharge your new responsibilities. We are now approaching the 18th day of a partial government shutdown. And each day of this needless shutdown pushes many of our government's vital services to the breaking point. While the House bill last year put a lot of work, reflects a lot of work that went into the bill, this bill, which is the Senate bill, reflects only the Senate's work product. But it's adequate in most respects, and most importantly, it was bipartisan and is supported by 96 of the 100 senators in the Senate. And most important, it will open the government if we pass it and send it back. The agriculture and also it contains back pay for the workers who have been furloughed and reimbursement for states that have had to cover shortfalls thus far. The Agriculture, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration and related agencies Appropriations Bill is a critically important piece of legislation. Through a diverse urban-rural coalition, this bill includes our farmer safety net and our food and nutrition programs. It provides over $23 billion in discretionary funding, $225 million above the FY18 enacted level, and it provides funds to cover the latest estimates for our mandatory programs that are required by law. It provides $2.73 billion for ag research, which is an increase of $114 million from FY18. And it's not as much as the House bill would have proposed last year, but these increases will ensure that American agriculture remains unparalleled in the world. According to USDA, more than 8,400 people are working without pay to inspect our meat, poultry, and egg products. Food safety, that's extremely important. This bill would fund the Food Safety and Inspection Service at $1.049 billion, which is above the budget request by the administration. The Farm Service Agency, whose county offices shut down on December 28th and are often the primary lines of communication for our farmers and ranchers by providing critical data, processing loans, and answering questions, is set under this bill to receive $1.62 billion. It's not enough, but in my district, every one of the USDA Farm Services offices is now closed. We need to open them. This legislation also makes significant investments in rural development by providing $3.8 billion, including $825 million in funding that's dedicated for infrastructure investments in rural America. Right now, as a result of the shutdown, there are absolutely no loans for drinking water or sewage system upgrades that can be made. Loans and grants for community facilities and distance learning, telemedicine programs are not being made. These are real consequences that affect the lives of Americans in small towns all across this country. Rural broadband programs are funded at $425 million, which is below $175 million below the FY18 enacted level. But most importantly, it rejects the President's proposed elimination of the program altogether, which would have had devastating consequences for rural America. In regard to international aid, it rejects the President's proposed elimination of the Food for Peace program and instead funds it at $1.7 billion, which is $116 million above the 18 levels. The McGovern-Dole program, which was also proposed for elimination, is funded at $210 million. Right now, across America, in every district, nearly 40 million people are facing the prospects of no food assistance through the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, the SNAP program. SNAP is dependent on our action. Without an appropriation from Congress, these benefits will stop. The bill provides $73.22 billion for SNAP. And today, I sent a letter to USDA demanding answers for how the department plans to administer SNAP in February and beyond should this shutdown continue. We need to pass this bill to end the shutdown. In my home state of Georgia, 1.8 million, 16% of the population receives SNAP benefits. In Massachusetts, Mr. Chairman, 785,000 people are at risk of losing coverage. In Oklahoma, Mr. Cole, 598,000 people are at risk of losing their benefits. This legislation provides the FDA with $2.97 billion in discretionary funding for FDA, an increase of $159 million above the FY18 level. More than 10,000 FDA employees are working without pay, while another 7,000 have been furloughed. And the shutdown is impacting everything from user fee collections to the FDA's inability to accept any new medical device registration applications. Mr. Chairman, from the food we eat to the medications we depend on, this bill touches the lives of every single American. As I stated the other day, this bill is not perfect. No bill ever is, but we must reopen the government. The security and well-being of too many people is at stake for us to do nothing. And so I support a rule passing this bill so that we can open this government and provide the services that we are constitutionally responsible for providing and obligated to provide for the American people.
Thank you very much, Mr. Aderholt. Welcome. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Congratulations to both you and to Ranking Member Cole, and thank you for letting us come and testify today, this evening. I also want to thank my colleague and good friend, the new Chairman Designee, and former Ranking Member of the Ag Subcommittee, Mr. Bishop. I know he will do a great job on behalf of Ag and rural communities. Unfortunately, as a lot of my colleagues are here around the table, I have to express my strong opposition to the bill before us, as well as the process by which the remaining FY19 bills are being dealt with by the new majority. Of course, anything but a fully open rule on appropes was condemned by the Democrats for the past 8 years, and the new majority, one of the first action is proposing a closed rule. As the former chairman of the House Ag Subcommittee, I worked to develop the original 2019 Appropriations Bill for Ag, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration, and related agencies. Worked very close cooperation with Mr. Bishop and of the other members that were on the committee. The priorities of the House Subcommittee, as well as hundreds of other House members, were part of that legislation. Starting last March, we developed a House bill with House priorities that were included. We drafted H.R. 5961 after we held 5 oversight hearings. We received and reviewed nearly 6,000 bill and report requests submitted by 355 members. We incorporated bipartisan House member requests covering House priorities from every corner of the country and from all demographics. And let me just provide briefly just a few of the examples where the bill that is before us fails to fund the important House members' priorities. When it comes to public health compared to the House bill, this bill provides $149 million less for the Food and Drug Administration. When it comes to public health compared to the House bill, this bill fails to include the two provisions that place limits on chicken imported from China. The House bill includes an outright ban on Chinese chicken in school meals. This bill does not. And last but certainly not least, rural broadband. In FY18, we established a pilot program to expand broadband in rural communities, and that is one of the greatest needs that we have seen in rural America. This bill provides $125 million less than what we provided in the House bill. These are just a few examples of why the new House majority's bill that is adopted from the Senate is going in the wrong direction. The other side wants to claim that these bills are bipartisan, but they're clearly not bicameral and have no input from the 435 House members that we heard from. Some of the House appropriators that we have lost over the years would probably be rolling in their grave right now if they knew that we were taking up the Senate spending bills without any input from the House side. So as Democrats used to say, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should. So I would urge urge the members of this committee to stand up for the House priorities, for public health and rural development, reject the strategy of passing the Senate bill that will, at the end of the day, not really bring us any closer to ending a government shutdown. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Mr. Price and Mr. Diaz-Balart from Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cole, other members of the Rules Committee. It's a pleasure to appear before you and to testify about H.R. 267, legislation to reopen and responsibly fund the Departments of Transportation and Housing and Urban Development. Now, our Republican colleagues tonight are looking wistfully at those House Senate compromise bills that we put together last fall. The equivalent of conference agreements, we negotiated them last year. We're being asked, don't we prefer those bills? Well, of course we do. Of course we do, but we missed an opportunity to pass those bills in September. We missed it again in December, and now we're in a shutdown. And the premium is on making it as easy as possible for the Senate to say yes, since they've already said yes to these bills. They said yes to this Transportation HUD bill. It passed the Appropriations Committee on a 31-0 vote, and they said yes in the full Senate with a bipartisan 92-6 vote. And this is a good bill. It provides $71.4 billion in discretionary funding, $23.3 billion above the President's request, $1.1 billion above the fiscal 18 enacted level. It's critical to the success of American families, communities, and businesses. In addition to maintaining existing infrastructure, it will allocate $17 billion for new transportation and housing projects in both rural and urban areas. Like last year, this includes several $1 billion of funding above authorized levels in the FAST Act to accelerate improvements to our aviation system, expand transit and rail networks, replace aging highway and bridge infrastructure, as well as funds to repair our affordable housing stock. Builds on the progress we've made since the enactment of the 2018 bipartisan budget agreement to ensure that vulnerable populations, including low-income families, seniors, veterans, the disabled, have access to reliable transportation and safe housing. Would also provide robust funding for flexible grant programs, especially home and CDBG, that allow towns and cities across the country, large and small, to leverage public and private capital to address their most pressing community needs. And just as important, this legislation would finally reopen these departments and allow more than 20,000 furloughed employees at DOT, over 7,000 at HUD, to receive back pay and to return to their mission, that is, serving the American people. The Trump shutdown has dragged on for more than 2 weeks, shuttering vital government services, creating chaos and uncertainty for families, businesses, and communities in each of our districts. Grants to help states and municipalities pay for upgrades to transit, rail, and aviation facilities put on hold. State departments of transportation now beginning to delay the onset of new construction projects. National Transportation Safety Board ceasing major accident investigations. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration no longer investigating information about motor vehicle manufacturing defects. That could put lives at risk. New hiring and training for air traffic controllers ground to a halt, exacerbating an ongoing staffing shortage. Disaster relief funding for states hit by disasters last year, funding that's already been appropriated, now remaining unallocated in many cases because staff at HUD remains furloughed. Meanwhile, we discovered just this weekend that HUD officials failed to renew more than 1,000 housing contracts for project-based Section 8 projects before the end of the year. That's exposing tens of thousands of tenants to possible eviction. It's madness, and H.R. 2267 would put an end to it, ensure that vital transportation and housing infrastructure is funded for the remainder of this fiscal year. This legislation reflects the best of bipartisan collaboration. It excludes problematic policy writers from either party. So I urge colleagues to support this bipartisan common sense approach to reopen the government without further delay, and would be happy to respond to any questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin, it's also want to congratulate Mr. Cole, and it's always good to see my fellow Floridian, Mr. Hastings, and a new Floridian on the committee. Congresswoman Shalala is also here. So again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity. I would like to also thank Chairman Price for his friendship and for, frankly, the collegial way that he has approached our work on the subcommittee. He is truly a gentleman, and it's good to see you, sir. Over the past 4 years, we have worked together to craft bills that reflect our House priorities. And again, I could not ask for a better partner. Mr. Chairman, unfortunately, I have no choice but to oppose the bill before us today. With this close rule, the Speaker is asking us to blindly accept Senate priorities. And really while turning our backs on the priorities of this body, of the members of the House. Mr. Chairman, we worked through the summer and fall in a bipartisan, bicameral way to come to a negotiated agreement. And you're right, we weren't able to get that across the line, but we still have an opportunity to hopefully do that. And that agreement protects the priorities of our members, of the members of the House. The bill before you today is frankly an affront to that process of compromise and of cooperation. This bill rejects a year's worth of bipartisan work with Chairman Price and his staff, by the way, to advance House priorities to build our nation's infrastructure and to restore our communities and to help the most vulnerable in our community. Last year, we worked across the aisle to include in our bill over 80% of member requests for transportation and housing. This bill disregards and totally just throws those requests and that work, helping our members, House members, throws that away. These are requests that you and other members of this body made on behalf of your constituents. So let me just, if I may, Mr. Chairman, throw out a couple of examples where my colleagues, and frankly, even my Democratic colleagues, where our Democratic colleagues are asking us to just kind of shortchange or toss all the work that has been done on the House proposal. So compared to the House position, this bill provides less. It really shortchanges the ports in our country, highways. We've talked so much about this is infrastructure being such a priority. This bill is an infrastructure priority, and yet compared to the House bill, this shortchanges our highways and also our air traffic control system. And for housing programs, again, compared to the House bill, this bill means less funding for people with disabilities, including our veterans, less for the neighborhood rehabilitation program, and cuts to housing for people in poverty and who are living with HIV and AIDS, something that's obviously a big concern to so many members, but particularly those of us that, for example, live in southern Florida. This bill also, Mr. Chairman, drops hundreds of bipartisan accountability provisions that we included in our report. And instead, this bill would give, frankly, a free hand to a number of bureaucrats. And on top of all that, this bill would not get us any closer to reopening the federal government. I've heard so much about how we got to open the government. I totally agree. But I fear that this bill will not do that. The Senate has no plans to take up this legislation, and the President, frankly, wouldn't sign it anyways if it reached his desk. So I fear that this is therefore an effort in futility. If we want to open up, and I think I've heard so much, and I clearly want to open up the federal government, this will not do that. This is just going to be another week of actually spinning our wheels and not reopening the federal government. I'm hoping I'm wrong, but we'll know at the end of this week. So I urge members to stand up for our House priorities, get things moving in the right direction, and respectfully reject this rule. Mr. Chairman, by the way, I have an amendment before you, and I can either speak on it now or whenever you'd like to. I'll take questions, whatever you'd like.
Speak on it now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm requesting that, that at least one of my amendments to the 4 Appropriations Bill before you be made in order, Mr. Chairman. And that the committee provide all the waivers necessary to consider the amendment. The amendment will finally provide legal status to Dreamers, and to those TPS recipients who will soon lose their status. You know, these are issues that so many of us have spoken about in a bipartisan way. Well, here we have an opportunity to do that with this amendment. It would also then provide $5.7 billion for the President that the President has requested for border security. In other words, we protect the Dreamers, we deal with the DACA folks in exchange for the 5.7. I think, by the way, this is good policy, Mr. Chairman. I think this would receive strong bipartisan support. And on top of that, I think this really is the way to move forward to get out of the shutdown. So again, Mr. Chairman, that's what it does, and I appreciate it. I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and I appreciate your suggestion. And as the gentleman knows, that even if we had a wide open rule, that amendment would be legislating on an appropriations bill, and it would not be made in order. And I just want to just say too, I mean, look at I think everybody on this side of the aisle wants to help the Dreamers and wants to help the TPS recipients, and we've been fighting for that, as you know, constantly when you guys were in charge, to no avail. But I got to tell you, it really frustrates me that they're used as political pawns. I mean, these are human beings. These are, in the case of the TPS recipients, many of them have been here for 20 years. They've obeyed our laws. They have to register and go through background checks. They've raised families. They have businesses. They pay taxes. I mean, these are good people, and we should celebrate them. And instead, they've been just told that by the President they're not welcome, and now we're told they could be a political pawn. We can maybe trade them for a wall, or we could trade them for something else. The same thing with these DACA recipients. I mean, we ought to help these people because it's the right thing to do, and we're going to move on that, and that is a priority. I just want to say one other thing too, and I have great respect for all my colleagues here, Democrats and Republicans. But to my Republican friends, I'm a little bit alarmed by your lack of urgency. I mean, I don't know whether you've been in your office, but people are calling, and they are in a panic, and they are, they're worried about everything from their food stamps to, the national parks to whether government contractors are to get paid. I mean, people don't know whether they're going to be able to pay their mortgages or their rents. I mean, people are panicked. I mean, time has run out. You guys were in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. You controlled everything. And you left town with the government shut down. This is extraordinary. It's unprecedented. This is the first time in history that we've begun a new Congress in the middle of a government shutdown. And so I get it, I would like these appropriations bills to reflect more of my priorities as well. But we don't have the luxury, to, go back to last year's business and, for the next few weeks, debate all these appropriations bills. I mean, my constituents and your constituents want us to do something now. I mean, this is a real emergency. I mean, 800,000 hardworking civil servants are either furloughed or working without pay. That's what an emergency looks like. And so I get it, and, but you guys could have passed a short-term continuing resolution to keep the government running if you wanted to have these negotiations continue. You didn't. You left town, and the government shut down. And here we are now trying to clean up last year's mess. And none of us, I certainly don't appreciate having the first thing we have to deal with in rules, last year's business. But I don't, you know, but we are where we are, and, you know, we need to clean up last year's mess now, before it does any more damage, and get people back to work, and then move on to our priorities, where hopefully we will be working in a more bipartisan way, not only on appropriations, but on a whole bunch of other stuff. So I don't have any questions, because we already know what's in these bills, and we voted on these bills already before. So I thank you for being here, and I yield to the gentleman from Florida if he has anything to say or any questions.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I echo your sentiments. I have no questions of either of the witnesses, and look forward to us getting past this particular period and the rancor that exists in the country. Let me just say, we're a better country than we have manifested of late. And I just hope that everybody understands that we are a united States of America. We are a very diverse community as a country. And we need to spend more time trying to heal our wounds and our divisions than perpetuating them. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chairman.
Right. Colleague, Mr. Cole?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everybody who came and testified today. And as I'm sure you're not surprised to know, Mr. Chairman, we view this somewhat differently than you do. Quite frankly, the president was here all December prepared to negotiate. He wasn't in Hawaii where the speaker was at. He offered a deal to cut in half the amount of money that he had requested for border security. It's reported in the press. I was not part of that negotiation, from about $5 billion down to about $2.5 billion. That's usually what people call a fair deal. Let's split the difference between something. And that would have stopped this government shutdown from happening. To say that we have voted on these bills, in a sense, is true. We voted on them last week, so I don't know why we're voting on them again this week, unless it's merely for political posturing. I agree with my friend, Mr. Adderholt, who I think summed this up brilliantly in one phrase. The bills in front of us may well be bipartisan, but they're certainly not bicameral. There is zero input from any member of the House of Representatives in those bills. My friend, Mr. Calvert, my good friend, Chairwoman McCollum, worked really hard in Interior. And my friend had the numbers exactly right on the Indian health care. If you care about Indian health care, you'd want to vote for the House bill. And that bill, as I recall, I was part of the larger conference on a bundle of bills, had been fully written out. Why in the world didn't the Democrats simply take where we had agreements with the Senate? You don't have to go back to the Senate bill. You literally had written out bills that could have been this today that would have represented House products. I would suggest the only reason it's not is because you somehow think that's going to be more embarrassing to the Senate. If that's the attitude in approaching a negotiation, you don't have a negotiation. And this is not going to move us one step closer to a resolution. I would suggest a lesson here for both sides, and I would direct it at my side as well. When you're dealing with something in domestic politics, if you're trying to achieve absolute victory, you're almost always going to fail, because it leaves you a divided country and it leaves you an embittered electorate. When somebody offers to split the difference on something, as the president did, that probably should have been done. But we've got products that have been negotiated out and have been compromises, and where, frankly, the priorities of 435 of our members are represented, other than just 100 United States senators, you're in a lot better shape. So I don't have a lot of questions here, although I'm not ever going to simply allow the United States Senate to dictate what the House of Representatives does in terms of funding. This is the most egregious surrender of House prerogatives and funding power that probably any speaker has ever done. We'll just throw away everything we've done for a year, and we'll take whatever the United States Senate managed to agree on itself and send that to the president. And we're going to do that knowing that it's not likely to get picked up by the Senate, and it's certainly not going to be signed by the president. So I would suggest that all those people that want to talk about negotiation actually start negotiating, actually go to meetings and send people that are empowered to make decisions, and look at something that's reasonable. A $2.5 billion reduction in what was a pretty modest request to begin with at $5 billion is, hey, that's a pretty good deal. That could have saved us all this trouble. Instead, I think we had people that wanted to fight a political war to the end, and the American people are paying for it. And frankly, I think that includes people probably on both sides of the aisle, but it certainly includes, the principals that were charged to negotiate a deal. So why we are doing this again, we did it last week. It's still sitting over there in the United States Senate. If they want to take them up, they can do it. But I suspect badgering them is not the way to get there. That's just my personal view. Again, I had a whole series of questions. I'm not going to belabor them because I could literally sit here and ask each member what was better about the bill that they had designed and written themselves, and they could each give me an answer about an hour long why what the House did was better. And and to say that we didn't get our work done, well, in a sense, that's true, although I will say in defense of the committee, that was the best record of getting appropriations bills on time in full in 22 years. This process would be a lot worse if we hadn't got the Labor H bill and the Defense bill and, a number of other bills across the line. So in terms of the record, frankly, it'll be interesting to see whether or not this Congress can pass 75% of government funding by September 30th. I hope it can, and I will actually work with you. But I don't think this exercise is going to move us to where I know you want to go and I know where I want to go, which is getting the government reopened. It's going to make everybody more bitter. It's going to make them more entrenched. It's not moving us in the right way. And I would suggest, too, doing it under rule is very much at odds with the manner in which the new majority said it wanted to operate. This is not the way to begin. This is a closed rule on a multi-billion-dollar, hundreds and hundreds of billion dollars of spending with no House member, majority or minority, liberal or conservative, having any impact whatsoever on a vast portion of federal spending. So I regret this egregious surrender of institutional power and authority. I think it's a bad example that will come back to haunt us because it'll be cited again. And I don't think, with all due respect to all concerned, that it offers any prospect of a negotiated settlement that reopens the government. So we can go through this exercise. We'll have a lot of fun on the floor, and we'll throw darts back and forth, and we can get a lot of speakers lined up. But nothing in this bill will move us toward a solution. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you very much. And
let me just, I agree with you. I wish we weren't in this mess that we're in. I think this is an unfortunate mess. And I think and I have nothing but the highest respect for the appropriators, both Democrats and Republicans, because I know how hard they work, and how they work oftentimes in a very bipartisan way. But I will repeat what I've said. I mean, I think we are at the point now where this is an emergency, and it is adversely impacting everyday people in this country, and we got to do something.
If I may, Mr.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just a quick response. If it was an emergency now, it was an emergency back in December when the president offered to cut in half the amount of money and keep the government open.
I thought he backed away from that.
Once it was rejected, he did. Yeah, I didn't leave it on the table.
Anyway, Ms. Torres, you want?
Well, isn't this the case of the pot calling the kettle black? It's laughable that my Republican colleagues are sitting here calling out, we could have done this, we could have done that, we should have, and unfortunately, we didn't. The 115th Congress, Republican members, chairmen, decided to leave office with two black eyes. Two black eyes. You shut down the government and you went home. That's what you did. You shut down the government and you went home. You didn't give a darn about anyone but yourselves. You put up your political, your finger to see which way the political wind was blowing. You lost the election, you lost the majority, and you decided to do nothing. Nothing for the 800,000 people that are out of work. Well, let me tell you something. Last week, the day after we got sworn in, I went to my mailbox here to clean it out in my apartment here in Washington. And you know what I pulled out of there? A rent increase. Almost $100 rent increase I pulled out of there. and my heart sunk thinking about those federal workers who also received a rent increase. But guess what? They haven't received a paycheck because of you. They haven't received a paycheck because you failed them. And now you're going to be failing your own constituents, continuing to fail them. You had an opportunity in September. You had an opportunity in December. You had an opportunity during the lame duck session. You chose to go home and do nothing. Do nothing. And now you sit here and complain. Well, I have many ideas on how we could have improved all of these bills too. But guess what? We didn't have an opportunity to debate any of that because you chose to not put up these bills for a vote. That was your choice. So unless you're willing to actually vote on something and put your name behind something, and I want to thank my colleague here. At least he had the courage to sign the discharge petition to help protect dreamers. At least you did that. So thank you for doing that. But you know what? We were missing one more signature. One additional member with a backbone could have helped us bring some relief to DACA. But we couldn't find that among the members that left. So I am sorry that we are where we are today. We also had an opportunity to open up the government while we continue to negotiate until February. We chose not to go down that route either. Well, what is it going to take? What is it going to take to get us to open up the government, the federal government? That is our primary responsibility. As a former mayor, I didn't have a choice. I was bound to pass a budget on time, dependent on the federal government. Local governments are depending on us to do our job, and it is about time that we did that. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Burgess?
Thank you. And let me associate myself with the comments of our ranking member, Mr. Cole, and particularly the comments he made on the ability to negotiate and means not everybody gets everything they want. But I will also say this Rules Committee a month ago did pass a rule that went down to the floor of the House and got 217 votes on an appropriations bill that did fund disaster assistance and did fund border security. Went over to the Senate where it failed because it lacked the 60-vote threshold. I've heard the word emergency used several times today. I agree, it is an emergency, and I frankly do not understand why the majority leader of the other body would not declare an emergency and bring that bill up for a vote and not require the 60-vote threshold, just as they've now had to do for almost every presidential appointment, as they've had to do for a number of things, because in this divided situation that we are in that has become so political, there are individuals in the other body who are simply not going to agree to anything. And I am reminded, of course, the former Speaker Boehner used to lament that he only controlled one half of one third of the federal government, and would always use that as his fallback position. You were going to find how difficult it is dealing with the other body, and mind you, they were allegedly our friends when we were having these difficulties in dealing with them. But let me just, Mr. Aderholt, that you're here, and of course, I do not understand why FDA is under the Department of Agriculture, but we'll leave all that for another day. Can I just ask you about the funding reduction that is in the bill before us today compared with the level that you had approved in your bipartisan appropriation negotiation previously?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Burgess, for mentioning that, because, of course, regardless of, like you say, FDA being in the ag bill is maybe a discussion for a different day, but the higher House levels, of course, are critical, as you know, being a physician yourself, to the industry as advanced medical products to the marketplace sooner, get it there safer and with greater efficiency. And the ultimate benefactor of higher levels going to FDA is to help the American consumer. But to answer your question, the increased coverage on critical public health areas deals with opioids, generic drug review, medical device security, more rapid drug and device production, and particularly, there was an additional $149 million in the original House bill, supported a number of medical product initiatives above the level in the Senate bill. And a few of those things, just to mention, was a promotion of the domestic manufacturing initiative that will help such things as continuous manufacturing that can quicken the flu vaccine production if a new flu strand emerges. The difference in the numbers on that is $38.5 million in the House version, $11.7 million in the Senate version. Also, the new domestic drug industry tries to incentivize drug compounders to improve safety controls. $12 million in the House version as compared to zero in the Senate version. And new medical data enterprise initiative, which tries to capture more health information and to make it available to drug and device reviewers at FDA. $60 million in the House version as compared to zero in the Senate version.
And I do need to point out how Dr. Gottlieb has done a phenomenal job at the FDA over these last 2 years, and the rapidity with which generic approvals are occurring is unparalleled in recent years, as well as their new drug approvals. So the additional money that you had proposed going to the FDA, I think, would be well invested. And of course, we'd done that work before on a bipartisan basis on the user fee agreements that passed in August of 2017, and then, of course, the Cures bill that passed right at the end of the Obama administration. So I think we've recognized for some time that the investment we make in the FDA is certainly one that is important, and it protects the American public, and at the same time, it just doesn't make sense to be ratcheting that back in whatever vehicle we decide to use to send something to the president's desk. This is funding that should be considered. And again, Dr. Gottlieb has done a phenomenal job in getting those products through in a very timely fashion, and has not compromised patient safety. The risk-averse nature of the FDA from 4 years ago has certainly changed. The culture has changed, and I, for one, welcome that. Mr. Bishop, you looked like you were wanting to respond.
Yes, let me just say this. The bill provides strong support for the FDA. The $2.96 billion that's provided for FDA salaries and expenses is $159 million more than last year's level. That's a 6% increase. The primary difference between this bill and the House mark is the level of the support for new initiatives. New funding for domestic drug manufacturing and new platforms for drug development is provided. The House bill provides the full requested amount for most of the administration's new proposals, whereas this bill is a compromise. However, the Senate bill takes a stronger position than the House bill on one key area, and that's opioids. And we've all heard a lot about opioids back home, and it's constantly in the news every single day. This bill provides $59 million in new funding for opioid prevention activities, which is $29 million more than the House bill did. Sustained funding to combat the opioid epidemic and targeted funding increases to ongoing FDA operations allows for a flexible approach to the many public health issues that are facing the nation. So while this bill is not perfect, and it perhaps would have had some areas funded more to the liking of many of us in the House, on the other hand, it does provide some stronger funding in areas that we all support, like opioid prevention. So, you know, if we could have gone to conference and had regular order, we probably would have been able to resolve this. But we weren't, and we are where we are, and we need to open the government.
Again, I would
bill will
submit
do
if the, reclaiming my time, if the Senate Majority Leader had suspended the 60-vote requirement, perhaps we could have gone to conference. We have heard the word emergency used several times this evening. I agree that an emergency situation does exist, and I think we're going to hear the President address that this evening, and I, for one, am looking forward to what he has to say. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
So a vote has been called. I don't want to, does anyone on our side have any additional questions or comments? Ms. Lesko, you want to welcome your
Yes,
first
thank
rules
you,
meeting?
Thank you, Mr.
Hope
Chairman.
you're not reconsidering.
I'll try to be quick. I do have a couple questions. One actually to Mr. Calvert, if he's still here. Arizona water issues are very important. And I think in part of your testimony, you said because we're adopting this bill, you had worked with the Senate to try to get in more money for water infrastructure. And so I was wondering if you could tell me what the shortfalls are if we pass this bill instead of what you had already negotiated on water issues.
Thank you. One of the issues that we have a new program called WIFIA. It's a Water Infrastructure Financing Program, and the Senate cut it back $14 million. It sounds like a small amount of money, but because it's used to offset the bonding authority, it actually equates to $3.6 billion in spending for infrastructure. That equates to tens of thousands of jobs, but also infrastructure that's necessary throughout the United States in aging water infrastructure and new water infrastructure like you're talking about in Arizona. So it was unreasonable, I think, for them to cut that. It's a bipartisan initiative, and unfortunately, along with a number of other items that the United States Senate, has their own priorities, as we do, and unfortunately, our priorities were not addressed.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, and this could go to either Mr. Bishop or Mr. Price, who's sitting at the table. I had heard repeatedly that the reason that we have to vote on these bills right now is so that we can get the government back open. So I guess my question is, when I was voting on December 20th, the House passed a bill that would have kept the government open, but not one Democrat voted for it. I wanted to know why. Why didn't you vote for it?
Before they answer, I can say that on the bill that the Democrats brought to the floor last week to keep the government open, 7 Republicans did join with us. So it seems like the bipartisanship is moving our way. But anyway, I'll let them answer.
Well, I think we all agree that our respective subcommittees did a lot of work and a lot of good work in working with our Senate colleagues and coming up with compromise bills, the equivalent of conference agreements. And I think we all wish that those were in law today. But the bill that the then majority put up in the lame duck session went beyond those bills, as you very well know, and included very controversial funding for a border wall that really the president had sprung on us very late in the season, and that was highly controversial, and so it shouldn't surprise anyone that was viewed as a political ploy and as something designed to let Republicans show support for the president, perhaps, but that wasn't really a serious. Really wasn't a serious opportunity for the two parties to get together on these bills that we had agreed on. We had a chance to do that in September. We had a chance to do it in December. The 4 bills we're talking about here today were part of a minibus. I honestly believe if we had been here one more week in the fall, we would have had these bills on ice, and that would have been a good thing. But we went home to campaign, and we didn't get it done. But the bill that the majority put on the floor in December was not the amalgam of these bills. It was, as you well know, a bill mainly about the border wall.
All right, well, I want to thank all of our witnesses for taking the time to be here. I would like to remind you to give our stenographer any prepared statements that you have or anything else you want to put in the record. And I appreciate your patience, and thank you for being here. And hopefully the next time you come here will be a happier occasion. Yeah. Are there any other members who wish to testify in this legislation? Seeing none, this closes the hearing portion of our meeting. At this time, the chair will entertain a motion from the distinguished gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. I move the committee grant H.R. 264, the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Act 2019. H.R. 265, the Agricultural, Rural Development, Food and Drug Administration and Related Agencies Appropriations Act 2019. H.R. 266. As you're exiting, please, so that the transcriber can hear us, the reporter can hear us. H.R. 266, the Department of the Interior, Environment and Related Agencies Appropriations Act of 2019, and H.R. 267, the Department of Transportation, Housing and Urban Development and Related Agencies Appropriations Act 2019, each a closed rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate on each bill, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations or their respective designees. The rule provides all points of order against consideration of each bill. The rule provides that each bill should be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in each bill, and the rule provides each bill one motion to recommit. Would someone please close the door? Finally, the rule waives the requirement of Clause 6A of Rule 13 for a two-thirds vote to consider a report from the Committee on Rules on the same day it is presented to the House with respect to any resolution reported through the legislative day of January 15, 2019, relating to a measure making or continuing appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2019, and I'm hoping that we meet that deadline, and my friend from Oklahoma and I can celebrate on that day.
You've heard the motion from the distinguished gentleman from Florida. Is there any amendment or any discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
The gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the rule to report a modified open rules for each bill before us today, H.R. 264, H.R. 265, H.R. 266, and H.R. 267. The rule would require that all amendments be received for printing in the portion of the congressional record dated at least 1 day before the day of consideration of the amendment.
You've heard the amendment from Mr. Cole. Is there any other discussion? Hearing none, the vote is on the gentleman's amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. In opinion, Chair, the noes have it. The gentleman has asked for a roll call vote. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings.
I vote no.
Mr. Hastings votes no. Mrs. Torres.
No.
Mrs. Torres votes no. Ms. Matsui. No. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Perlmutter. No. Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Raskin. No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Scanlon. No. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Morelli. No. Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Shalala. No. Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Cole.
Aye.
Mr. Cole votes aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mr. Woodall. Aye. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mrs. Lesko. Aye. Ms. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Chairman.
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
The clerk will report the total.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments or discussion? Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment to the rule. I move that the committee amend the rule in order to make an order and provide the appropriate waivers for H.R. 264 for amendment number 1 offered by Representative Palmer, amendment 2 offered by Representative Palmer, amendment 3 offered by Representative Davidson, and Amendment 4 offered by Representative Diaz-Balart. Make an order and provide the appropriate waivers for H.R. 265 for Amendment Number 1 offered by Representative Newhouse, Amendment Number 2 offered by Representative Newhouse, and Amendment Number 3 offered by Representative Diaz-Balart. Make an order and provide the appropriate waivers for H.R. 266 for Amendment Number 1 offered by Representative Newhouse, Amendment Number 2 offered by Representative Davidson, and Amendment Number 3 offered by Representative Diaz-Balart. And finally, make an order and provide the appropriate waivers to H.R. 267 for Amendment Number 1 offered by Representative Buck, and Amendment Number 2 by Representative Diaz-Balart.
Appreciate it. And as the gentleman knows, many of these are legislating on appropriations matters, but having said that, I would recommend a no. You've heard the gentleman's amendment. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor vote aye. All those opposed vote no. No. The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
I vote no.
Mr. Hastings votes no. Mrs. Torres? No. Mrs. Torres votes no. Ms. Matsui? No. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mr. Perlmutter? No. Mr. Perlmutter votes no. Mr. Raskin? No. Mr. Raskin votes no. Ms. Scanlon? No. Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Morelli? No. Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Shalala? No. Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole votes aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall votes aye. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes aye. Mrs. Lesko? Aye. Mrs. Lesko votes aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Mr. Chairman votes no.
Clerk will report the
It takes some
total.
getting used to this majority.
4 yeas, 9 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments or discussion? Hearing none, the question is now on the motion offered by the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Hastings?
Aye.
Mr. Hastings votes aye. Mrs. Torres? Aye. Mrs. Torres votes aye. Ms. Matsui? Aye. Ms. Matsui votes aye. Mr. Perlmutter? Aye. Mr. Perlmutter votes aye. Mr. Raskin? Aye. Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Aye. Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Aye. Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Aye. Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Cole? No. Mr. Cole votes no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall votes no. Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess votes no. Mrs. Lesko?
Let's go.
Mrs. Lesko votes no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman votes aye.
Clerk will report the total.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to, and that is it.
Mr. Chairman?
Who's going to handle this for the, I will handle it for the majority. Who's going to handle it for the minority? I think Mr. Woodall is the appropriate person. I can't wait. With that, the Rules Committee is adjourned.
You were going to ask. I'll see you now when the work responsibility. Yeah.